Well, top of the day, welcome aboard for the 6th installment of the Naval Historical Foundation's second Saturday webinar program. As chairman of the board of the foundation, I want to convey to you the greetings from the entire board and say that we're all looking forward to this morning's event, which ought to be very interesting. As you know, the foundation has been around for almost 100 years. And now we're going to go back in time about 130 years to Mahan's drafting of the famous book, Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And as we discuss this today, it seems to me that some really good questions come to mind straight away. First of all, is this book of and of the past relevant to today? What has history had to say in the last 130 years about what Mahan said back in the last century at a critical point in time, which has some very interesting parallels to today? So back 100 years ago, Great Britain was the dominant sea power by far. It was being challenged by Germany. There was a lot of Me Too coming from Japan, but the power that supplanted Great Britain was the United States, and primarily through sea power. So now, fast forward to today, and we have a new player on the horizon, and that's the People's Republic of China. To what extent are there parallels between what happened 100 and some years ago and today? To what extent are Mahan's ideas still not only relevant, but likely to be studied and adhered to by today's players? I think this is a terrific idea for this topic today. And we are very, very pleased to have a couple of renowned people with extensive backgrounds in this business of sea power, Mahan, and of course the present day. So we look forward to meeting Seth Cropsey, the Honorable Seth Cropsey, and Captain Retired Dr. Jerry Hendrix, also a member of the NHF board, to lead us through what promises to be a very interesting discussion. So I'm very pleased to be with you, and I'm going to turn this over to our executive director, Rear Admiral Sonny Masso, to take you through the rest of the program. Thanks for joining us, and please remember that the foundation needs your help. We need your financial support, and we also need you to try to help us to grow the membership by introducing new people to what I believe is a phenomenally fantastic organization, serving history and mentioning and emphasizing how important sea power is to this nation as we go forward into this century. Thank you very much. Sonny, please take it away.
Thank you, Admiral Fallon. Welcome to the Naval Historical Foundation's second Saturday for December 2020. This is the 6th in our series, and we look forward to continuing this series into 2021 as we intend to explore such topics as the 30th anniversary of Desert Storm, the life of Vice Admiral Sam Gravely, United States Navy involvement in Vietnam from the Brownwater Navy and HAL 3 perspective, and the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. We are grateful to our members and viewers for your contributions. If you've not done so, please consider sending in a year-end contribution to help sustain our programs and further naval history. If you are not a member, please join. If you are a member, please consider giving a family member or a friend a gift for the holidays. They will be glad you did. We as a foundation just marked the first anniversary of the passing of our former chairman, Admiral James L. Holloway II. During a celebration of his life at the Naval Academy Chapel, the attendees heard songs sung by the St. James School Choral Group and moving eulogy from the St. James School headmaster, Reverend Dr. Donald Stewart Dunham. You would think, given his career capped with a tour as Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Holloway would be the most notable naval officer to ever come out of this small Hagerstown, Maryland boarding school. But you would be wrong. That distinction has to go to Alfred Thayer Mahan, who graduated from that school in 1856. The son of a West Point professor, Mahan would graduate with the class of 1859, second in his class. Serving at sea during the Civil War and on overseas stations during the subsequent years of American naval decline, Mahan earned little recognition for his seamanship skills. Instead, it was at the recently opened Naval War College, where he earned the appointment as a lecturer, that he made a name for himself. It was those lectures published as a series of books, starting with The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1873, published in 1890, that earned him notoriety not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Mahan's reasoned arguments calling for the building of potent fleets capable of protecting free trade on the high seas and defending the nation's shore resonated with many influential individuals within American society, particularly a New Yorker by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Whereas the nation was focused internally in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, thanks in part to an emerging capable naval force, the United States had established itself as a world power. At the Naval Historical Foundation, we could not help but note there are some parallels with the time periods in which Mahan started giving his historical lectures at the War College and the present. To discuss those parallels from then to today, we have with us two of our nation's top-tier scholars on the critical role of sea power. With us today, we have Seth Cropsey and Jerry Hendrix. Seth Cropsey served as assistant to the Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, drafting major policy statements on the nuclear freeze, defense economics, and U.S. global strategic aims. He subsequently became policy director for the Voice of America, leading efforts to explain U.S. policy on the basing of medium-range ballistic missiles in Europe to international audiences. Then, as Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy for Policy, his portfolio included maritime strategy, strategic education, defense reorganization, and special operations capabilities. For President George H.W. Bush, Cropsey served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. Subsequently, he served as the first department chairman and distinguished professor at the George W. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, and then as the director of international broadcasting for the United States government. He is currently a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and director of Hudson Centers for American Sea Power. He holds degrees from St. John's College and Boston College. In contrast, Jerry Hendrix is currently vice president with the Telemus Group, a national security consultancy and service provider. Prior to joining Telemus in 2018, he was a senior fellow and director of the Defense Strategies and Assessments Program at the Center for a New American Security. A retired Navy captain, Hendrix served in the United States Navy for 26 years. During his distinguished career, he served on the staff of the CNO Executive Panel as the senior military assistant to Andrew W. Marshall within the OSD Office of Net Assessment, and as the director of the Secretary of the Navy's Advisory Panel. While in this role, he was verbally ordered by the Secretary to assume the duties of director of the Naval History and Heritage Command and curator for the Navy. A Boilermaker from Purdue University, Hendrix holds advanced degrees from the Navy Postgraduate School and Harvard University, as well as a PhD in War Studies from King's College, London. Both of our discussants have published titles on sea power that we believe Mahan would have read approvingly especially in the case of Jerry Hendrix' dissertation work published in Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy, the U.S. Navy, and the Birth of the American Century, published in 2009. This book actually earned the Navy League's Alfred, Thayer, Mahan Award for Literary Achievement. While Hendrix's book first focused on the rise of American sea power in the 20th century, Seth Cropsey's Mayday, The Decline of American Sea Power, published in 2013, warned of waning U.S. maritime supremacy and that potential consequences of budget cuts will have profound consequences sooner than we might think. 4 years later, Seth Cropsey delves into greater details of those profound consequences in Sea Blindness, how political neglect is choking American sea power and what to do about it. In this follow-on work, he surveyed the contemporary seascape and among his sage observations saw China as undermining American hegemony in the Western Pacific. Now, if one questions the need for such hegemony, Jerry Hendrix' new book being released this month, To Provide and Maintain a Navy, why Navy primacy is America's best strategy, should clear out any doubts. Hendrix builds on the case made by Cropsey in his 2 volumes by incorporating additional historical arguments to explain what free seas represents, a foundational principle of Western Enlightenment. With that, it is my pleasure to welcome Seth Cropsey and Jerry Hendrix to our program titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, Current Implications for National Security. As in previous Second Saturdays, we intend to offer our discussants an opportunity to extol their views, and then I'm going to moderate your questions from all our viewers. Please come in via the chat function and ask your questions, and I'll try to get to them all. Gentlemen, over to you for your keynote remarks. For the rest of you, enjoy.
Seth, what inspired you to write Mayday and the follow-on Sea Blindness? Both were exceptional books. Was there something, though, that that kind of got in the way there after Mayday that maybe the message hadn't been heard? Can you explain that process? Because they were both just phenomenal books.
Thank you, Admiral. This goes back to what the Reagan administration understood correctly as the United States' position as a maritime power. And more important, what the Reagan administration actually did in order to preserve and advance our position as a maritime power. And I'm happy to discuss that at length if we have time later. But what I saw at the beginning of the second Reagan administration was that the congressional commitment and certainly public commitment to reaching the 600 ship Navy goal was starting to diminish. The layman's secretaryship at the Navy brought it very close, but the important signal was from Congress that and the administration was that enough had been done. And since that time, what's most important is that the size of the Navy has contracted. The Navy's understanding of its role in providing security for the United States has become unfocused, where it was focused very clearly, as evidenced by the maritime strategy during the Reagan administration. And this has been reflected in declining naval budgets, in smaller and smaller fleet sizes, in diminished 30-year shipbuilding plans, and certainly in the nation's understanding of the role of sea power in defending the United States and its allies, as evidenced by, as I say, declining budgets and a host of other issues that show that we've forgotten as a nation how important, as a maritime nation, how important our sea power is, what role it plays, what the consequences are for ignoring this in the future, and the threat that is represented by China's increasing and advancing naval buildup, and by the measures that they've taken from preserving port and inland waterways infrastructure to investing in the same in other countries at strategic points around the world. And so it looks to me as though Mahan's ideas go this way and the United States is going that way. And to put it very simply, Mahan understood clearly the importance of sea power for a nation surrounded by water, as we are on 5 sides. And the American people have lost that understanding. It's the number of congressmen who can articulate this clearly is small. Those who can do very well at it, but it's far from a majority, and it's far from a bipartisan question issue, from a bipartisan consensus, which it once was. And so I thought, and I still think, that there is a growing hole in the nation's understanding of how sea power defends us. And I don't mean just the Navy. I mean merchant marine. I mean the infrastructure that supports it, the technology, and so on and so forth. And I think that's very serious for our future as great power competition reemerges and promises to become a deciding factor in the future of the United States as a great power.
Thank you very much for that explanation. It was wonderful. To you, Jerry, how does what influenced you to write in your dissertation about Theodore Roosevelt, and then take a moment to kind of talk about your latest book, which I had the pleasure of reading, and hopefully I'm the first person to have read it since it hasn't come out yet. To provide and maintain a Navy, why naval primacy is America's first best strategy.
Thank you, and I appreciate you giving that advanced copy a read. So I, of course, joined the USS Theodore Roosevelt as a lieutenant in the winter of 1995, and made 2 deployments on her in 2 years. And because the Roosevelt has a very rich library, which contains everything that Theodore Roosevelt wrote so far as published books during his lifetime, and the fact that I'm a reader, I began to read a lot of TR's works while I was on board the ship, and I also had the opportunity to get to know members of the Roosevelt family, as well as become involved with the Theodore Roosevelt Association, a historical society that's dedicated to his memory. So I began to actually look at a number of the controversial topics, historical topics surrounding Theodore Roosevelt, and decided to do an examination of one of them, which was the Venezuela crisis of 02-03, from the operational viewpoint, essentially looking at the logbooks of the naval ships that were involved in order to see if it was illuminating. And I found that the technique worked as an approach. And so I moved on to look at the Panama Canal, Panama independence movement, as well as the Moroccan crisis, then ultimately his Portsmouth Peace Treaty. all from the operational level. What was going on with the fleet in support of Roosevelt's naval policy, his foreign policy, because his foreign policy was a naval policy. I became aware of the fact that Roosevelt was a peer and a friend of Alfred Thayer Mahan, that they had corresponded with each other for the better part of 10 years, beginning in 1890 and then all the way through Roosevelt's presidency. Also, they brought into the conversation Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the author of what was called the Large Policy, which was an expansion of American influence, the need to annex Hawaii, the need to move out and gain additional coaling stations for naval power, and to begin compete on the world stage, along with the other imperial powers, colonial powers of Europe. And so this was a moment in which sea power began to emerge as a factor in American life, as a factor of foreign policy. And it was something that the nation had had previously. The nation was founded as a sea power, the 13 colonies. Each one of them understood the importance of foreign trade. They made investments in their navy. We had the original 6 frigates. You know, our early years were somewhat dominated by topics dealing with sea power. But then as we began to settle the continent, we became distracted. And then Roosevelt sort of brings us back into focus. And it's really Roosevelt's policies and investments that creates the 20th century as the American century. And it was a century dominated by naval competition. So whether we want to recognize that or not, World War I, the United States contributed significantly in a naval way. The interwar period was a time of great naval innovation. World War II was largely dominated by naval competition. Even our movement of forces to, supplies to Russia and forces to Europe were guaranteed by naval power. But it's only after World War II that the United States becomes distracted. So first in Korea, then in Vietnam, we become distracted by continental land competitions. We sort of stray away from being a sea power to becoming a continental power. We become interested in what's going on land. We allow the Army to grow. It's interesting, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which I derived for the title of my new book, To Provide and Maintain a Navy, the Constitution tells the Congress that you will provide and maintain a Navy. The Navy is a permanent investment on the part of the nation. But the Army is not. The language surrounding the Army is temporary. It's transitory in passing. The Continental Congress has a fear of a large standing Army. And so they minimize it within the constitutional document itself. But after World War II, we grow a large standing Army, specifically really after Korea, and we become absorbed with land competitions. Now, we have a time of a great voice, the 1980s and the maritime strategy. When John Lehman emerges and President Reagan is supportive of this, and we began to regrow the Navy, we began to compete with the Soviet Union and the Soviet Navy at sea and really dominate that domain. But shortly after the end of the Cold War, that begins to disappear, as Seth has already spoken about so eloquently. And we began to become focused on the Middle East, then into Yugoslavia, and then back into the Middle East and Afghanistan again, as we become absorbed in sort of these small land wars. And we lose sight of the Navy, and the Navy crashes. And this is part of one of the things that I began to write about in this book, which is looking at these competing views of continental powers versus sea powers, the importance of really getting away from sort of the continental competitions, which are somewhat disastrous for us, and reinvesting again in sea power, which allows us to influence events ashore and also maintain the free seas and free navigation, which are, to me, foundational to our understanding of the very notion of freedom as comes out of the Enlightenment. And so I advocate within this is that we, one, re-identify with the sea, and two, began to make the investments in sea power, both naval power, as well as in our merchant marine, maritime commercial, which we've allowed to languish. Our industrial base for building ships has shrunken considerably, going from over 50 major shipyards during the height of World War II down to just less than 10 major shipyards in the nation today. And so this is where I'm at in sort of my public thinking right now, is to get away from the idea of how many ships do you need in the Navy? Numbers are important, and I'm supportive of calls for a larger Navy, but I want to get at the question of why do you need a larger Navy? What is the American role in the world, and why is it that you need a Navy, and the structure of that Navy to support that role in the world? And so that's where my thinking has gone, and where I hope the national conversation follows.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I guess a question for both of you, and we'll begin with Seth Cropsey. In 1984, the Goldwater-Nichols Act came out, and it was kind of created a construct forward where no longer would we embark on any military action without it being completely joint. And then I think 30 years ago, there was the evolution with Desert Shield Storm, where we would no longer embark in anything that wasn't really joint or coalition. And in today's conflicts, it's not just joint and coalition, but it's joint, coalition, and interagency. In that construct, and given particularly in your book, Seth, where you talk about kind of the changing nature of the Mediterranean, you talk about some scenarios such as an invasion of a Baltic state, things like that. Where does Goldwater-Nichols really kind of detract from having a more robust view of sea power?
Excellent question, Admiral. Well, the most obvious place is that Goldwater-Nichols levies a tremendous requirement to supply joint commands, like the Joint Staff, like the combatant commands, with naval officers. And time spent on staff work is time that is not spent learning how to operate a ship and fight a ship. So that's the first standout that comes from Goldwater-Nichols. The second is more subtle, and that is that the insistence on or the persistence of Goldwater-Nichols and the ideas of jointness in it has really changed the way the U.S. military thinks about doing its own job. There was a seminal article published by the U.S. Naval Institute of Proceedings in 1954 by Professor Samuel Huntington from Harvard. And the most important, there are many important takeaways. I think the most important one applies no less today than it did well over half a century ago. And that is Huntington's observation that a military service that does not have an idea of its purpose, of its mission, of its strategic goals is in serious trouble. And when the services are restricted in their ability to formulate, to come up with, to imagine what their roles are in the future by the necessity that everything be vetted by and approved by the Joint Staff and the combatant commanders and the whole joint structure of the United States military. When that happens, it makes it extremely difficult for the services to do what Professor Huntington said was an absolute requirement. And one result that you see from that is that although everybody talks at length and correctly about the reemergence of great power competition, the Navy has yet to formulate, articulate, publish an idea of its idea of maritime strategy for how to deter war with China and if war breaks out, how to win it. I think that Goldwater Nichols has contributed substantially to that, and not only in ideas, but this applies as well to what kinds of ships we build. Because if you don't have an idea of what you're going to do with ships, it makes it extremely hard to decide intelligently on what kinds of ships you should be building. Although I think that Goldwater Nichols has had some salutary effects, for example, in training forces that will deploy to combatant commands so that they arrive at the combatant commander's area of operations fully ready to work with each other. I think on the whole, it has been a negative. And when you mentioned that operations today and exercises virtually require all the services to participate, that was one of the things that the authors of Goldwater Nichols argued precisely against, and said that their grant of greater authority to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs would prevent, in fact, that is, the necessity that everybody be involved in everything. So that's the short answer to your question.
Thank you, sir. Jerry, what are your thoughts on the same question? Do you need me to repeat it?
No, it's I think it's one of the most important questions we have facing our military today in our nation, because in many ways, Goldwater Nichols has frozen us into this 30-30-30-10 split, 30% between each of the military services, and then 10% of the DoD budget left over for OSD, the Office of Secretary of Defense, to disperse with as they see fit. And this has sort of locked us into a rigidity in the manner that we strategically approach the world. While Seth was speaking there, I just pulled a report that's here on my shelf next to me down because I remembered a number there that highlighted the fact that between 1954 and 1957, during Eisenhower's New Look era, the Air Force budget was 49% of the overall defense budget. The Navy was 29%, and the Army was 22%. The Army, it took a 40% cut because the Eisenhower administration viewed the world as something that was going to be dominated. The competition at the time was dominated largely by air power, and then by naval power, and then by the Army last. We no longer have the ability to make those kind of puts and takes within our budget. And I use the example of 10 years ago. There was an idea that I had a tangential impact upon, which was air-sea battle, which was a modern derivative of the air-land battle concept that emerged out of the Army and the Air Force following Vietnam. Don Starry and General Dupuy were the two principal authors of that, for how the Army and the Air Force were going to take on the challenge of the Soviet Union on the European plain. Well, air-sea battle was going to be essentially the Pacific comparable version of this, where the Navy and the Air Force were going to work together to deal with a rising China. It was something that everyone had seen coming since about 1994, but that concept had no more been born then a decision was made that no, you cannot have air-sea, that it must become a joint domain, all service, and that there had to be a role for the Army in there. And by the way, where does the Marine Corps fit into this, and how does this fit within Goldwater Nichols? And all of the innovative aspects of that strategic dialogue were immediately beaten out of it, and we essentially came back to the common mean, which was, where's the 30-30-30 split within this? And so it's really hand-tied us on how we're going to approach the world today. And the world today largely is dominated in the commons. And when I say that, I mean the competition that's going on between the United States and China and the United States and Russia is happening either in the maritime domain, or it's happening in the space domain, or it's happening in the cyber domain. And those are domains where, quite frankly, the Army doesn't have a large role. And so in normal times, under normal circumstances, pre-1986, pre-Goldwater-Nichols, we would be able to do puts and takes within our budget to emphasize what works for us and de-emphasize what is not relevant to us, but we are unable to do that now. We're also captured in this idea that somehow we're spending too much on defense. We're actually spending less historically as a percentage of GDP, and I know people get uncomfortable with that because 740 billion looks like a large number, but in fact, adjusted, for inflation, it's not that large of a number as compared to what we've done in the past. But yet we have to take that number, whatever we arrive at, and sort of divide it. So I think that Goldwater-Nichols has caused some serious issues. It's something that we need to address. I hope the Congress is helpful to us, because right now in the great power competition that we're facing, which is very real and it's very imminent and it's very dangerous for our way of life, because both of these states, Russia and China, as authoritarian states, want to change the very nature of the systems. All the rules and norms that we've essentially built up over the last 70 years, they would like to do away with, because those rules and norms are a threat to their internal domestic political stability. And so they want to see those go away first in the commons and then ultimately on a larger global scale. We need to step up and defend the concept of a free sea, because a free sea is a critical component of freedom, individual liberty.
And by the way, echoing Jerry's excellent point, the redirection of resources from the Army toward the Air Force in the 1950s took place under a president who was an Army general.
That's a great point. Certainly, the foundation of the instantiation of the Air Force itself, it was on Eisenhower's watch.
I mean, it's a demonstration that it's possible to think strategically and still have an allegiance to a particular or identification with a particular service. Goldwater-Nichols has nixed that ability, as Jerry correctly points out.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. Kind of rolling back to the 19th century, and this is a question from a Naval War College student. Mahan, who wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, very successfully had his advocate, and his voice box was extended through President Theodore Roosevelt, even in his time as a Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But if you think about during those times, the mindset was really internally focused. So while America was celebrating its first centennial, Custer was going down in the defeat at Little Bighorn. So there weren't a lot of people that were thinking about great thoughts about the oceans and things like that. So, but he was still able to sell his message. Jerry mentioned earlier, obviously Secretary Lehman as a voice, a promoter of the Navy. Are there those who exist today that we just haven't heard from yet? What are your thoughts about that? What is it? What will be the clarion call, and who might deliver it, or who should deliver it?
Seth, I'll let you go first.
Okay. The President of the United States should deliver it. I'm afraid that the clarion call will be an action that takes place in the Western Pacific that either surprises us or leaves us sort of on the back foot. There are people who can articulate what we're discussing today. Representative Whitman from Virginia is one of them. Former Representative Randy Forbes is one of them. There are people who know what's going on with the Navy, and they are all able to, and in their various positions on the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, they make good, cogent, sensible, intelligent arguments for it. They largely fall on deaf ears, not only in Congress but outside Congress. So I I'm sorry to say that I think the only thing that will awaken the American public is some unfortunate and regrettable action that China takes in the West Pacific.
Jerry, other thoughts?
Yeah. This is actually a point that I've raised with some senior officials recently in the current administration. I remarked upon the fact that former Secretary John Lehman, who I greatly admire, and I'm very pleased that we are about to name one of our new destroyers for him because he certainly is worthy given his contributions. But Secretary Lehman is one of the few people that can write on naval issues and immediately get published. Seth is actually another person that often appears in the Wall Street Journal. But when I think about people who can write an op-ed that's cogent, coherent, pro-naval power, and then get it placed in the papers of record, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, that number is relatively few. And I made the observation to a senior official that there are a lot of navalists. There are people that we all know who think about this and write about this on a fairly common basis. But a lot of them are not what I would term heavy hitters. So, John Lehman's a heavy hitter. He can get something out and put it out there. Randy Forbes is a heavy hitter, but he doesn't write as often as, I would like. You look at some of the young people that are coming up. So Representative Loria, who's former commanding officer of a ship, and she is becoming a leading voice in the House Armed Services. You look at Representative Gallagher of Wisconsin, also a leading voice. Representative Banks of Indiana actually authored a piece of legislation called the 5 Ocean Navy Act, which was sort of derivative of Vinson's 2 Ocean Navy Act of 1938, I believe. But these voices are coming. But the problem is they're not resonating in the internal nature of American life. I'm often frustrated that the American people do not understand their direct tie with the sea. I always ask people, do you like Walmart? Well, yes, I do. Do you like Costco? Well, yes, I do. And I said, well, then you love the United States Navy, because it's the United States Navy that makes that big box store work for you, where, the product that's purchased at the lowest price, where it can be most cheaply made, is delivered to you, across vast expanses of the ocean. That story is not well understood, and we need to make it understood both in sort of popular life, in the sense of national conversation, but it needs to be driven into our cultural life. In the 1980s, one of the great things that occurred beyond the maritime strategy was, you had Top Gun out. You had a number of TV shows that were based around the United States Navy. There was a number of novels, including The Hunt for Red October and Flight of the Intruder, that leapt into the national imagination. And so the nation came to the Navy in the 1980s in a way it has not done over the last 30 years. And we need to find a way of encouraging both the national conversation as well as the cultural conversation.
Thank you for that, Seth. Did you want to pile on that in any manner, or go to the next question?
I'm looking for places to disagree with Jerry about, but I'm not finding them.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, a very profound, scientific phenomena was the creation of and construction of and use of the Panama Canal all those years ago. And it strikes me that one area that the most Americans are ignorant about is global warming, in the sense of the polar ice caps are melting, and there's been great exploration by China and Russia, and maybe a little minuscule amount by us in navigating that passage. So if you think about merchant super tankers and that with all kinds of products, they can actually get to the East Coast of the United States 11 days quicker if they go north. And so as this phenomena occurs, Is this part of the free seas that you talk about in your chapter, the creation of a free and safe sea? To you, Jerry, but also just in general, sea blindness really didn't tackle this so much, but I know you have a lot of thoughts on it, Seth. But the global warming, not so much why it's warming or if it's warming, but it is, and it's representing a potential challenge. Is this something that might be used to focus a greater attention on a more powerful merchant marine and a different way of delivering goods and services for free trade?
All right. Well, this is a great question, and absolutely, global warming and the changing of the Arctic is having a significant impact on the way that we look at the seas. The Arctic area, there's a great northern route that's opening earlier and earlier, and it's remaining open longer and longer every year right now. And that's allowing nations in Asia to make it to Europe much more quickly by going across that northern route. Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is that despite the fact that it's open, there is still some floating ice within it. And there is a need, especially early and late into the season, for these ships to be accompanied at times by icebreakers. Russia has built 40 icebreakers, including 9 nuclear-powered icebreakers that are truly heavy. Some of these icebreakers are going to be armed. They're going to be aspects of the Russian Navy. Russia has applied, because it has begun to fortify some of its offshore islands, and it uses those islands to draw its baselines. So it's amended its baselines to extend its claim of territorial seas farther and farther out. Russia's actually applied to interpret an aspect of the United Nations Law of the Sea to treat sections of the Great Northern Route as internal waters, almost as if that Great Northern Route will become something like the Mississippi River, and that they wish to then levy a piloting fee against countries or nations or ships that are going to transit that they need to have a pilot on board, and they need to pay Russia for that, for transiting those waters. This runs counter to our views of a free and open sea. China is very interested in this legal precedent that Russia is attempting to establish, because, of course, they are asserting an internal waters sovereign claim over the South China Sea, which we all know about, the 9-dash line, and also aspects of the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea. China would like to see those recognized as internal sovereign territorial waters. And so this is part of what I raise within my book, is that this challenge, this idea of extending territoriality over the free and open sea, is a major threat to how the United States and the West has viewed the oceans for much of the last 5 centuries. And so it's something that we need to address now. But it is, in fact, the advent of global warming that's given Russia this opportunity. And there is an economic reason to go north. It's much more quick and cheaper to deliver energy as well as raw materials between the European peninsula of the Eurasian continent and then China, which is one of the most burgeoning markets in the world. And so people want to do that. The question is whether we allow them to apply these legal claims, which are a threat to essentially our rules and norms and the way that we approach the world.
Seth, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. This is exactly where a strategy or the lack of a strategy is so important. Points that Jerry makes about territoriality and about the United States' traditional view of what constitutes the open seas, the high seas, applies directly to, as he said, South China Sea, Yellow Sea, East China Sea, the Northern Passage, and insofar as that's concerned, it's directly connected to our understanding of what do we do about this? I mean, what is our role? How do we how do we incorporate this into the large picture of emerging competition and the Navy's preparedness, the Naval Services preparedness to prevent war and to win it if necessary. And these two areas are not only important in themselves, but they're important in the larger project of that dates back to the beginning of the American Republic, and that is freedom of navigation on the high seas, which has been an essential principle of U.S. diplomacy and national security since the Washington administration. So this is extremely important, not only on its own merits and because of the costs that it would defray, but most important because the encroachment of China and Russia on the open seas, on the high seas, is a precedent which, if we allow to stand, has implications all over the world, from the Mediterranean to Europe to, I mean, you name it. It challenges our ability to go in to littoral areas, to operate from littoral areas, and it also challenges the United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty, to which we observe, but to which we are not a signatory.
Yes, sir. And this question's largely been answered, but I want to give credit to the person who asked it, a gentleman named Louis Leotti, and it just kind of polishes both your messages, if you don't mind. But his question is, what, if any, application does Mahan have to the incipient big power competition between the U.S. and China on a global level in general? And we sort of talked about that with merchant shipping and things like that. And in the Indo-Pacific in particular. And of course, we think about, just as Seth just said, the Straits of Malaysia going into the Straits of Malacca, Taiwan Straits, Spratly Islands, things like this, where you're seeing a lot of Chinese dominance in that area. Maybe a quick point on that to address this gentleman's question.
Yeah, well, Mahan is a direct counter to something that has been mentioned previously in this discussion. I think Jerry brought it up. I may have brought it up, but the maritime powers have a regrettable history of being diverted from their focus on the seas by continental issues. The great Athenian statesman Pericles warned his fellow citizens to stay behind the wooden walls, and by wooden walls he meant ships, and not to challenge the Spartans on land. And Pericles' idea was pretty straightforward: that Athens gained its commerce and wealth from trade, and trade took place then over the seas. Athens heeded Pericles' advice while he was alive. Pericles died in the plague, and then the Athenians drifted toward challenging Sparta, vastly their continental superior on land, and in 26 years managed to lose the war and a naval competition as well. The same thing applies to Venice. And just looking back at history here, Venice was the maritime power of the Mediterranean from early medieval times up until the Renaissance. Around the 16th century, early 16th century, Venice became distracted by the internecine warfare of the Italian city-states. For some reasons which are explicable because of their interest in supplies for shipping, but for others because they simply couldn't resist the temptation to be distracted, to get involved in the wars of the city-states. Their naval power declined from them and ended basically in the early 18th century. Mahan's advice to them, I think, would have been, you're losing it. You're a maritime power. You depend for security. You depend for economics, for the financial well-being of your state on the seas. If you lose sight of that, you're doomed. And they were doomed. And that's the message for today. If we continue to lose sight of what Mahan regarded as critical to the maintenance of great power status, it will not end well for the United States.
Thank you, Sir Jerry.
Yeah, so the Chinese are absolutely alive to the contents of Mahan's approach to the sea. And they, in reading him, and it's very clear that they've been reading him very closely, that they are aware that the sea presents the greatest opportunity to them. It's absolutely essential to them, but it's also the largest threat to them. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, they know that the road can never be wide enough, long enough, deep enough to keep them supplied with the raw materials, whether it's ores or whether it's energy in the form of oil or liquefied natural gas. They are totally dependent on raw materials coming from Africa, Australia, and South America to be able to fuel their economy. They are a resource poor nation that's trying to build itself industrially. And so they're totally dependent on materials being shipped. And the only way, and this is a point that Mahan makes very early in the first chapter of his great seminal work, they're totally dependent upon the efficiencies of seaborne transportation. And yet they fear the sea because it is a conveyor of free materials, free trade, and free ideas. And so they have been attempting, in many ways, by hook or by crook, to alter the character of seaborne transportation. So, you know, Mahan believed that battles could be won decisively at sea, that wars can be won decisively at sea. China believes that the sea can be controlled from land. As a continentalist power, they believe that they can project enough power, influence, authority from the land over the sea. Now, they're building a large navy. They're building aircraft carriers. They're building destroyers, cruisers. Their new cruiser is very impressive. It's very close to our own Ticonderoga. But the fact is they're very dependent upon their shore-based missiles. And what seems to be clear, when we talk about the free sea, and of course, we're going back to Hugo Grotius's 1609 paper on the free sea. But when that paper came out, there was an alternative, which was the closed sea. And there was a sort of a subsection. There was a carve out to the concept of the free sea, which is territorial seas. And at that time, a decision was made that a nation could claim territorial seas out to what they called the 2 cannonball rule, which was twice the range of a cannonball shot, which originally was 3 nautical miles, and now today under international law is out to 12 and in some places 14. So there is this carve out that nations can claim territorial seas. China is looking at that. And in many ways, this idea of the closed sea has always been a Damocles sword hanging over the concept of the free sea, because the Chinese are saying, hey, look, I have these new missiles. I have DF-21s, I have 26s, I've got my bombers. If I can maintain territorial control, security over an aspect of the ocean, is it not mine? Can I not claim it as my territorial possession? If I build these 5 artificial islands in the South China Sea and have extensions of weapon ranges, is that not my sea? Is it not my territory? And you can see when what we call the string of pearls investments of commercial ports stretching from the South China Sea around in through the Indian Ocean and all the way to Africa, you can also see the embryonic aspects of naval ports, which also could come with weapons that could extend weapons ranges. And this is the great threat that we look at, is the Chinese are seeking to close the sea and then have it essentially under their authoritarian rule and not have the free transmission of trades and goods and ideas, most importantly ideas, which they fear in places like Hong Kong and at Taiwan. They need to close those off. And so I think this is the fundamental competition of our time, even though we don't recognize it. This is why the sea is important and why growing the Navy to defend that on a day-to-day basis. The Navy has two roles to play at any given time. It's the preserve the peace through naval presence and influence, and then it is the win the war aspect of it. You need to have a balance in your naval force structure in order to maintain presence, to maintain those rules and norms, but you also need to build the potential that if you jump ugly with me today, I'm going to beat you. And we have failed to keep that balance over the last 30 years.
So to that end, and kind of a follow-up, when Mahan speaks of force concentration all those years ago, I guess we understand how they differ today only in the sense that, you know, we no longer are in the Philippines, Clark Air Base, Subic Bay, to speak of. We certainly have a FedEx and merchant presence, but the same with Guam. We haven't really, you know, built that up. Are there locations that you would personally recommend and just say that we need to have, you know, not just naval presence in some certain locations, but we need to have ship repair facilities, and we need to have, you know, fuel, and we need to have ordnance and things like that? Any thoughts on just extending that a little bit, and certainly comparing it to Mahan's view of the need for force concentration in a domain?
Well, greater presence in Australia would be useful, and the way China is dealing with Australia these days, probably certainly something that's worth exploring for the new American administration. Attempts have been made and should be increased to develop a strategic relationship with Vietnam. The vulnerability of Chinese shipping to attack and denial in the choke points between China and the Middle East and Europe also suggests possibilities for deeper relationships that could lead to basing agreements with other Southeast Asian nations. And I think that you know, that the inattention that we're increasingly paying to the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, is an area where is a mistake. China owns most of the container shipping facilities at the Athenian port of Piraeus. They have a deal that's about to be consummated with Israel to build a shipping facility in Haifa, about a couple of miles from the main Israeli naval base. There are opportunities in Israel and throughout the Eastern Mediterranean where there's a fear of greater Russian influence as Russia seeks to extend its influence from its bases in Syria. The similar opportunities present themselves vis-a-vis Russia in Romania. So, and the Russians are interested in the Baltics, and that's another place where a greater presence and more developed port facilities, infrastructure, basing agreements could be very useful to the United States. So I think the world is, there are many places, and that leaves out, of course, South America, which ought to be included. But I think there are plenty of opportunities, and an administration that understands the danger that China represents would take steps very quickly to reach out to those nations and come to agreements with them for bases.
Yes, sir. Jerry, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'll just dovetail very quickly on something that Seth got at the end there. It's important that we pay as much attention to the threat in the Arctic and in Europe as we do in Asia. And I say that because I can not conceive of a situation where something would go south with us vis-a-vis China and the Western Pacific, that Russia would not take that opportunity to make its move to recover its strategic territory, the buffer zones that it so deeply desires to have back within its orbit. And the fact is knowing how thin we are spread right now with regard to the size of our overall military and sort of the limit of our strategic vision right now as a nation, which is significantly limited, that I would suspect that the Russians would make a move in the Baltics or in other aspects of Europe, shall we say. They certainly have demonstrated aggression with their seizures of territory in Georgia, their illegal attempt to annex Crimea back within Russia's territorial holdings, their continued presence in aspects of Ukraine. It's very clear that they have no respect for international rules and norms. And so I have every expectation that they would do something. So the idea of having a naval base in the Baltic, perhaps in Poland or perhaps somewhere amongst one of the Baltic nations, would be of interest to me, and it'd be a great place for something small like the littoral combat ships, specifically the LCS-1s, to operate with their steel hulls. I think that we have to have increased presence in the Black Sea. I think the fact that the Russian annexation of Crimea has kind of put into abeyance the treaty requirements on who can get into the Black Sea and how long we can stay there. They're in such violation of international rules and norms that I'm not sure that treaty adherence is really the #1 priority at this point in time. And certainly what they're able to do now with their naval base in Syria. I mean, if you look at the Kaliningrad enclave and then you look at what they're doing in mid-Europe and then down into Syria and Crimea, and then you factor in the ranges associated with the Iskander surface-to-surface missiles, as well as the S-300, 400, and 500 surface-to-airs, you begin to recognize that Russia could erect a new Iron Curtain over Europe, essentially at a moment of their choosing. And so, again, territory is key. This is something we go back to Mahan and in many ways back to Mackinder, is the understanding the criticality of territory. Losing Subic Bay and access to that is huge for us. I mean, the idea of that deep bay, the ability to do maintenance that far west, it's something that you simply can't make up. But Australia is an important investment for us. Looking at, there's a great deep bay in Papua New Guinea that we should probably look at partnering with the Australians and the local government to try and develop that. Our partner, confederated partner in Palau is important, and then continuing to develop Guam and of course Pearl as sort of our reach back point. One of the things that we think about is we're putting a lot of long-range deep strike capabilities on our submarines and our ships, but our reload capability at sea is practically nil. We lack the tenders to do significant reloads at sea, and so virtually everything in a wartime situation is going to have to retrograde to somewhere that there's calm waters to do a reload. So where are those calm waters? Where are those bays? And that's something that some people are looking at, others are not. But you cannot get away from geography when you consider these two competitors, China and Russia.
This next question, thank you both so much for that very insightful response. This next question is kind of a conglomeration of several questions, but it kind of goes to a point we spoke of earlier with joint and coalition, and the idea is, do we do enough? Now, certainly we have an Aegis combat system relationship through cooperative engagement capabilities and things, global, sensor netting, things like this with Australia. Obviously, the Japanese maritime self-defense force with their Kongo and Chokai class and things like that. I think Spain. We have the phased adaptive approach for land-based missile defense in Romania and Poland. And we've got some additional capabilities in and around that allow us to really have some sophisticated INW indications and warning and sensor queuing and netting and that. Is it enough? And where are we most strong? Where do we need to go in the future? Clearly the Spanish have been there, the Australians and Japanese, and Poland as well. But are there some other thoughts that you have along those lines for coalition support and other capability?
Seth, do you want to go?
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So obviously the idea of continuing to encourage our partners and allies to make their own investments and then selectively choosing where we're going to partner with our advanced technology so that, one, they are able and ready to adapt it within their own force structures, and then also work alongside us are sort of critical questions. You want to be concerned that technology that you share with a partner doesn't get shared with one of the other competitor nations. And so that's sort of a common question that we always have. The other thing, too, is beginning to build sort of the partner infrastructure in the Pacific that would be similar to what we've built over the last 70 years in the Atlantic. So we could talk about the Quad. We obviously have a 1v1 relationship with Japan. We have a security relationship with South Korea. We have security relationship with the Philippines. We have a relationship with Australia and New Zealand. And we're building something with India, but none of them are interrelated relationships where there's any types of crosstalk coordination across the span of all of those. So in some cases, there are historical issues. I mean, it's very difficult to get the Japanese to sit down with us and the South Koreans at the same time. But these are the types of things that we're going to have to overcome if we're really going to choose efficiencies. Now, with that being said, I also want to come back and foot stomp because we've just come through 4 years of a national conversation about the importance of alliances. And it's important that the allies themselves step up to provide their own support for their own national security, rather than just be viewed as being dependent on the United States. And it's also important that the United States not think that simply because the ally is doing this, we don't have to do that. We've had far too much experience over the last 30 years that included my active duty career, where longtime critical allies have chosen not to go with us. In some cases, that was wise on their part. Perhaps we were not making a wise decision ourselves. But we need to learn that lesson that if the U.S. Is going to go and do something, that it has to have at least a nascent ability to do it on their own. And if they have partners and allies to come alongside, so much the better. But the fact is we have over 50 allies, 48 of them are across oceans. And so the Navy really is the thing that knits the alliance together, regardless of who it's with.
Seth.
Yeah, I would add, as far as new partnerships are concerned, the one place that comes to mind that is the most important is Taiwan. Taiwan sits at the geographic center of the first island chain. It controls it is immediately proximate to straits that would allow the Chinese Navy out into the Central Pacific and toward the second island chain. Our relations with Taiwan are still burdened by the agreement made by President Carter over 40 years ago to de-recognize them. And so it is all but impossible for us to have normal military relations with them, normal diplomatic relations with them. There are things that the United States has done, especially over the past 4 years, to increase Taiwan's security, for example, weapons sales. But there is no command center to coordinate operations, exchange information. There's no ability to communicate with, very little ability to communicate with between the United States and Taiwan's military. We don't allow high-level visits between, for example, the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command and Taiwan. There is a tremendous amount that could be done to what it really amounts to building on the provision in the Taiwan Relations Act to supply defensive services and equipment to Taiwan as a means of deterring and, if necessary, defeating China, which would very much like to, and says it would, cross the 100-mile Strait of Taiwan and seize it by force. They haven't ruled this out. Xi Jinping, the head of the Communist Party, he's no president at all, he's not elected by anybody, has talked repeatedly about the China dream, and that includes the annexation of Taiwan. And it is directly in the interest of our presence, our ability to deter China, our ability to win a war, if there is one, that Taiwan be able to fend for itself, that we be able to support it. And the measures are not in place to do so today. They ought to be.
Yes, sir. So I want to bring us to the present, and thanks to Bill Erickson, the executive director of the Surface Navy Association. He collects every year articles that are published in the War College Digest, the Institute Proceedings, other periodicals, and they're really more in the tactical eaches of things. And this discussion is really strategic, but in terms of trying to make the compelling case about an expanded Navy, if you look at some of the titles of some of the really brilliant articles that were published this year, you look at A Fleet Without a Rudder. Now this is not a pejorative. This isn't saying we don't have any leadership in the Navy, but the point is what's the national call for our Navy, because we seem to always be at sea, but yet we're not at war. And then that extends to personnel tempo kinds of issues. Another one that was in proceedings in January of 2020, fatigue is the Navy's black lung disease. So no one's getting any sleep or rest or otherwise. And I think we can appreciate what that means. Again, not whining, okay? And it's not necessarily, it's just the demands of the missions that we are assigned from national requirements put us at sea a lot and make us very busy to where, a normal 8 hours night sleep is not ever effectuated unless you're an aviator. I say as a SWO. A better way to build a watch, Bill, and it's all crafted. It's a great article. Lenny Capella, in about 15 years ago, when he was commanding officer of the Leyte Gulf, he had a blue gold concept where literally half the crew, worked half a day, and it had a lot of efficacious capability, but not ever really adopted. But this better way to build a watch, Bill, was a great article as well. And these are written by really, pros from Dover, post major command captains, guys, that are there thinking about how do we fix the moment? How do we fix Jim Moses from the Naval Academy class of '69 wrote, "They don't build them like that anymore," about shipbuilding quality and things like that. How does that play into your book? So to provide and maintain a Navy, Mayday, sea blindness, really way more strategic than tactical, but yet what is the fleet thinking about? And that's a microcosm of exactly what a deck plate officer is thinking right now. Any thoughts on this?
All right. I'll lead out with this. After World War II, we had a tremendous fleet. I mean, we were at 6,000 ships in August of 1945. We quickly shed, almost 5,000 ships within the first few years after the war. But we also changed the model in which that we approached the world. For those first few years, we went back to sort of being a cruiser fleet where we would send squadrons of ships out to show the flag, express our interest. But really, for the first couple of years after World War II, we were getting our feet back under us, in many ways, sort of recovering our readiness and training, because we had been consistently at war for the better part of 4 years at that point, and there was a need to sort of take a breath. But Korea, in many ways, put us back onto put us onto the modern model, which is the hub and fleet model, where we've been out making these persistent deployments, going out from the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast, growing 7th Fleet, going also 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean, and sort of showing the flag and demonstrating this American presence. Now, that was fairly easy at the beginning of this. We had a lot of ships, and so if someone wanted to have a gray hull with a white number and a red, white, and blue flag and a gun on it, we could always send that. And so over time, these presence requirements mounted as these regional combatant commanders. First of all, the regional combatant commanders grew beyond just Pacific Fleet, as well as then Europe, to find all these different areas of the world, and they all wanted a ship. So if you look at the Cold War in the 1980s, sort of the pinnacle when things really were stabilized out, we had a requirement for about 150 ships at sea each and every day, which is something we could do when you had a 600-ship Navy, because you could have a ship on deployment, you could have a ship going on deployment, you could have a ship in training, and you could have a ship in maintenance. Essentially, it was a 4-part rotation where we had enough cruise ships and time to make sure that the ships were well maintained, that the crews had been trained, and that we had sufficient numbers forward. But as the Navy got cut after the Cold War, and we crashed hard, if you really look at what happened in the 1990s, we went from 584 in 1989 down to 450 within about 3 years, and we dropped another 100 within another 4 years after that. We crashed through 350 in 98, and we went through 300 in 2003, and then we bottomed out in 2015 at 271. But what was the requirement for ships at sea? Well, it dropped from 150, but it dropped down to 128 for a few years, and then it got down to 113. And even today, we have a persistent requirement for between 105 and about 112 ships out at any given moment. What that means is it's no longer a 25, 25, 25, 25 in rotation. You're in sort of a 1/3 rotation, and something's had to give. So whether it's the material maintenance of the ship or whether it's the training of the crew, something's had to give, because our deployment times have actually gone up. My longest deployment when I was on board a ship was 8 months on board TR during combat operations in '97. Even when I went to the Arabian Gulf in 2007 on Peleliu, that was still just a 7-month cruise. Well, 8 months is sort of becoming a norm. And so, when I was on board TR after we had the accident with Leyte Gulf, we had to go port and starboard in CIC. It was me and one other guy. It was 6 on, 6 off as we were trying to sleep and still maintain, qualifications in there until we could rebuild the watch teams. So I have a sympathy, but I didn't have to do that for as long as crews are today. They're out there for 8 months and sometimes 12 months, and now they're not making port visits over the last year of COVID. So it's a very, very harsh environment, and it's something I think we have to look at. The bottom line is, had we actually drawn down our forward deployed commitments in line with our fleet, we'd only have about 75 ships underway today. But 75 ships is not enough to cover U.S. national interests worldwide. That's why we're trying to keep it about 110. but we're breaking the fleet to do that.
Seth.
Yes. The questions of op tempo, of training, of maintenance, of how morale is affected, how recruiting is affected, how budgets are affected, are all critical questions. There is no doubt about it. The articles you cited identified real, substantial, and difficult challenges for the Navy. I fear, and I'm deeply concerned, that these issues, including budgetary ones, and the number of ships that Jerry correctly pointed out, are the things that get in the way of the most important issue, which is, what are we about as a Navy? What is the mission? What is the strategy? Where do we go in order to deter and, if necessary, win a war against China or China and Russia at the same time? If it's possible to articulate that, and it has not been possible so far to do so, then the questions that we've just discussed, that are so important to the fleet's everyday operation and to the Navy itself, will start to fall in place. They will start to fall in place because if we are able to articulate a reason for a large Navy, which I believe is easy to articulate if you're able to say what you will do with it, then the other questions will start to resolve themselves. Then you will be able to say to congressmen and the public and the administration the questions through its Office of Management and Budget, the need for changing the way funds are distributed at the Defense Department. Then you will be able to say, because we are doing this, because our objective to provide security, maritime security and security for the United States is this. You have an argument with the plan, let's hear it, and we'll talk it out. We'll make it a national conversation. But until that large question, the most important one, is answered, these other questions will continue to occupy the attention of OpNav, congressmen, everybody concerned, because they are so fundamentally important. But they will not be answered unless we can make a large statement of what we're about.
That was a great answer, and I appreciate that. And I think many of us recall the earliest days of our CNO, Vern Clark, and when asked by anyone, how many carrier strike groups should we have? How many carrier air wings should we have? How many submarines should we have? His answer was generally the same, and it's, what do you want us to do? And so not to imply that there was hand-wringing, but he immediately, one of the very first things he did is he instantiated an N7 organization under Denny McGinn. And from that, there were the derivation of what they called mission capabilities packages. And they laid out warfighting capabilities from overhead sensor to SOSUS array beneath the sea and everything in between to define a unit of measurement of theater air missile defense or expeditionary warfare or otherwise. But the point was back then was to make it kind of science and warfare capability based to define what that requirement would be. But alas, it didn't fit into the budget process, and it didn't, you know, I don't know really, it just seemed to not go where we thought it might go, you know, in its earliest days. But I guess with all that being said, in your mind, is the carrier strike group still a major unit of measurement for the force structure of the United States Navy? And do you see that changing? You know, I think the price tag on these vessels is so high now that a lot of people are saying, well, can we do as much with less and this type of thing. So that would be a question. And then in a concomitant sense, even with a merchant marine, and we talked a little bit about, you know, Russia has 40 icebreakers. You know, we have a little more than Polar Sea and Polar Star, but, you know, we're under probably 10. What are your thoughts on all of that in the future? Carrier strike group, is it still efficacious? Where do you see us going or needing to go?
Okay. Well, I mean, I have been raising questions about the efficacy of carrier strike groups for the better part of, you know, 6-7 years now, and of course have taken multiple spears for doing so. That being said, I think the carrier can remain a central part of the American way of sea power, but only if the Navy is willing to make significant investments in the carrier air wing. We focus far too much, I think, on the carrier without talking about, you know, to come back to your question of, you know, from Admiral Clark, what is it that you want it to do? Well, if you want a carrier to provide sea control, then $15 billion for the Ford class is perhaps a bit too steep a price for a sea control carrier. I can do sea control for quite a bit less with a Hornet air wing. But if I want the carrier, if I want a super carrier to do what super carriers are supposed to do, and we know this because of the historical documents that went into the creation of the Forrestal class, which was to have a carrier that was large enough to launch a large enough aircraft that could fly deep into the Soviet Union, deploy a nuclear weapon, and then recover back on board a carrier. And that really drove the Forrestal to be as long as it was, because physics being what it is, if you've got a very large aircraft, it takes a certain amount of space to take it off, and then it takes a certain amount of space to mechanically stop it. And that's how we received and got the super carriers that we have today. But the fact is we have super carriers today that are carrying essentially light attack air wings that can only go 500 miles or so. And so if you want the carrier to be effective in a great power competition against either Russia or China, then you're going to have to build an air wing that can actually span the distance that's imposed by anti-access area denial capabilities. And thus far, we haven't made those types of investments. And not to mention, we allowed the Ford class cost to escalate to where it's coming in around $15 billion a copy, which is just absorbing far, far too much of our shipbuilding budget. So we need to, one, try and pull down the cost per unit of the carrier. And that's one thing that came out of the most recent, the Trump administration issuing of its 400 ship Navy plan on Friday, or was it Thursday, where they talked about that they would truncate the Ford class at 4 and then move on to something that would be perhaps smaller, but certainly cheaper, so that we could produce carriers in sufficient numbers that they would be effective in a future competition. But, you know, to the larger questions on this, and I just wanted to foot stomp on this, I think Seth is absolutely correct that we have to think strategically, and we have to make a strategic argument to the nation about why these investments are important. I was pleased to see the Trump administration issue a large shipbuilding plan, you know, that actually lays out how to get to 350 within 10 years and how to get to 400. It's good that someone actually gave a 30-year plan and showed what the real costs of that are, even if they're leaving. After all, the Obama administration established the 355 number in December of 2016 as they were leaving. It's perfectly fine for administrations to put this forward on the way out. But I think that we have to go beyond the numbers. And again, coming back to, you know, the book that I've written that will be coming out here shortly, to provide and maintain a Navy, we have to come up with that strategy, and we have to sell that strategic vision to the American people. And so if anyone's interested in that, I would just encourage you to take a look at that one. It's available, and I'll provide the link to the Naval Historical Foundation.
Thank you, Jerry. Seth, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no capital ship has lasted forever. All of them have been replaced by something else. The same thing will happen to the carrier at some point in the future. I don't think Jerry said anything. Jerry just didn't say anything that I disagreed with about the composition of the air wing. I think that is essential. for exactly the reasons that he mentioned, which is that China and Russia and other countries that that are competitors of the United States understand what the danger is of allowing a carrier to roll up to their coasts and launch its aircraft. And so if they are successfully able to deny access to places from which a carrier can now operate aircraft, then the carrier's functions, abilities, efficiencies are lost or muddled or severely shadowed. So for the immediate future, the carrier strike group remains essential. But for the future, a little bit further down the road, a few years, not long, the abilities of the air wing are going to become the issue, and I think added to that are cost questions, and so there will be greater consideration of conventionally powered carriers. And yes, I know the arguments about sustainability and how much supply is required for conventionally powered carriers, but there is cost, and cost has to be considered. Terry wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to just foot stomp on that too, in that with the carrier out there today, of course, everyone notices, where our aircraft carriers are. They're a great diplomatic tool. But I will tell you also that everyone is concerned where the 4 Ohio SSGNs are. Because ever since we converted those first 4 of the Ohio class over to carry up to 154 VLS tubes, which is to say Tomahawk missiles, although other types of missiles could fit in that, people have become very concerned where those are. Specifically, I believe it was the Michigan that had such a significant role in Libya when it launched, I think, 118 missiles. These are things that this is an alternative path that, given the survivability and the stealthy nature of submarines, that as we're building the new Columbia class as replacement for our strategic deterrent boats, that if we were able to cut in a sideline of producing SSGNs alongside our SSBNs, then we would have that submerged capability that has the ability to generate strike mass from beneath the seas. That is a path that we're looking at, that if we're unable to get the carrier air wing aligned, that there is a way that we could move forward where we could maintain that great deterrence factor, conventional deterrence factor, from beneath the seas into the future.
And there are immensely more capable weapons that could be put in those tubes than the TLAB.
Yeah, so we're into the age of the conventional prompt strike hypersonic weapon, and that's going to change the nature because of the increased range and lethality and survivability of that weapon going forward. And I know that there's been discussions that could fit on the Ohios. It certainly will fit on the Virginia Block 5s that are in construction. And I think that that's a war-changing capability that's coming, over the next decade.
Our last question, and I just can't thank you both enough for a brilliant program, and we'll get it out on the net as early as possible today. But the last question is, organizations like ours, the Naval Historical Foundation, a lot of the executive directors and chairmen of the different organizations speak regularly about our relevance and what we should be doing. And I know that people like Bill Erickson at Surface Navy Association, Tim Oliver at the Navy Submarine League, Birchie Green with the National Maritime Historical Society, Pete Daly at the Naval Institute. We've got folks watching from every one of those organizations, and we ask ourselves every day, are we as relevant as we can be or should be? How would you advise us, these organizations, and others as I might have omitted, to how do we raise the bar, and how do we be advocates of your great thoughts and works, and how do we support our Navy better from the foundation of history to the necessity of future capability creation.
Seth, I'll let you go first.
I speak to, well, before the pandemic, now it's less, but it still exists. I speak to various civic groups like councils on foreign relations, councils on foreign affairs, civic groups around the country. And my usual talk is about, covers many of the points that we've talked about today. The number of ships at sea, our requirements and commitments, the problems that Navy is experiencing with personnel, with lengthening deployments, with repairs, with training. I relate them to issues that are going on today, accidents between surface ships, deployments that last almost a year, the effects on families, and so on and so forth. And what I hear every single time is, we had no idea of what you're talking about. We have never heard this before. We don't know, and it's extremely interesting. What can I do? So I tell them to write to their congressman and to write to their senator, and if any of them are writers, write for publication. I think it's, I don't think that the importance of reaching people outside the Beltway or outside the navalist circuit, I don't think that the importance of doing that can be exaggerated. People simply do not know. The civil-military divide in this country continues to grow. There are twice as many recruits from the Fort Bragg area as there are from more than twice. I don't know, it's 4 times as many recruits from the Fort Bragg area as there are from Manhattan, which is like 10 times the size of the population of the statistical metropolitan area there. So I think it's extremely important to engage, to create a national debate, to speak with congressmen who aren't aware of these issues. Many of them are intelligent and they will understand this. Whether they do anything about it, that depends a lot on how persistent we are, how persistent you are. But the country as a whole, which is not aware of this, is not aware of their dependence on the seas, is not aware that the Navy protects the lower priced tennis shoes that they buy at Walmart. We just have taken this as a nation all for granted and expect that we'll go on living in this world no matter what happens, no matter what the size of the naval budget is, no matter what no matter what the purpose of the Navy is, and no matter that people simply don't understand it. So that's just a case for reaching out in every way conceivable and that resources allow to reach the citizens of the United States.
Thank you, sir. Jerry, closing thoughts?
Yeah, it's Seth has really teed this up well. I will tell you that some 8 years ago, I was given my dream job, verbally ordered by the secretary to head on over and become director of the Naval History and Heritage Command. And for my last 2 years of active duty, I had the chance to be curator for the Navy and to be in charge of the art, the artifacts, the written record of the Navy and up in the archives, as well as overseeing the 9 major museums. But at the end of that, as I came to the time when I was going to retire from uniform, I had to make the decision on whether I was going to continue to try and come back and apply for the position as a civilian, or whether I was going to move on and do something else. And it was a very difficult thing for me to make the decision to leave the History and Heritage Command and to go out. But the decision came down to what would be my life's work. Was I going to be primarily consumed by the Navy's past, which is glorious? I think that we have the greatest Navy that has ever existed in the history of the world, and I think that there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest that. Or was I going to be consumed with the Navy's future, and in fact, our nation's future? And so when I retired, I made a decision. Not only was I going to sort of break with that, but I began to focus on a strategy of not talking to ourselves. I shifted from writing in traditional naval journals to writing in a broader array of journals. I wanted to get out and discuss the Navy and its ideas and the influence of sea power and the importance of the Navy as a number in the naval strategy, but to a broader audience. And that was one of my primary concerns, is that a lot of the institutions that I had dealt with, those institutions were becoming consumed by an internal focus. You know, how do we maintain our membership? How do we grow our membership? How do we maintain the stability? And in fact, I think that the growth is in becoming apostles, as it were, of the Navy, and spreading the message of the importance of Navy in American life, whether it's our economic life, if it's our security life, whether it's our cultural life, and getting out there and drumbeating that to the maximum extent to get to these people that Seth is talking to when he goes out to these civic organizations, many of whom that I've spoken with. When I go back home to the American Midwest, where I'm from, and I speak with family, friends, and local institutions back there, they have no idea, Seth said, of sort of the challenges that are facing this nation and the world. Our present condition is assumed, and they don't understand how fragile that assumption is. And in fact, it's being challenged on the high seas. So I think that my challenge to organizations, that are associated with the Navy is, I believe absolutely in our museums, and I support our museums because they're a center of naval cultural life. But we have to take that message on the road and find a way of getting to a broader audience. And that's why, quite frankly, that I've been, working and writing as I have over the last 6 years since my retirement from active duty.
Thank you so much. And of course, one of the organizations I neglected to mention that's very critical is the Navy Memorial, and the great work of Frank Thorpe and John Harvey as CEO and as chairman. For those of you out there, Jerry Hendrix' book is amazing. I received it on, I think, Thursday morning, finished it last night. And it's a short but thoughtful read, and it's, again, to provide and maintain a Navy, why naval primacy is America's best first best strategy. I'm holding up kind of the copy you get when it's a bootleg, like, bootleg Beatles concert or something like that. But I'm very appreciative, and it's a great honor to be among the first to read this phenomenal book. One of my mentors in my career is Bob O'Donnell, a retired Navy captain. And he introduced me through his professional connection to Seth Cropsey more than 20 years ago, even though Seth doesn't look like he's that old. But the book's Mayday, and I read it when it first came out, and then again, Sea Blindness. These are extraordinary and very thoughtful reads, and they're very strategic, and kind of when you read them, you sort of feel like, and this is true with Jerry Hendrix' book, that I just finished this book and now it's up to me to do something. I need to do something with this, like the Confessions of St. Augustine or Seven Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. But the point of the story is that these great scholars shared with us this morning in the early afternoon some immensely powerful thoughts, and I hope that the end result of this, through their exhorting us to step up and to tell the tale, to our elected leaders and to anyone who has ears to listen, academics and otherwise. Hopefully they'll be spoken of as we're speaking of Mahan today in the future. I want to extend my personal apology for the technical difficulties that we had. I still don't know what the nature of those were, and you'll be seeing this later in a live format, and it'll also be put on YouTube. But forgive us, it won't happen again. We'll figure it out and get it right. But as always, the foundation thanks you all for your participation in the audience in this webinar, and hope you enjoyed it. We thank Jerry and Seth for their great expert analysis. Buy their books. And if you haven't read them, you need to read them. And don't get them from Amazon. Get them from the Naval Institute if they're there to support a great cause and a great organization. There at the beginning, we had representatives from about 20 different states. Who knows how many it would have been if we hadn't had our problem. But I want to thank Captain Chuck Chadbourne for his advocacy to the Naval War College, because I know we had a lot of questions from them, and that's deeply appreciated. We want to send our best wishes for a wonderful holiday season. We're, I think, in the third night of Hanukkah, and Christmas is coming, and in the Advent season for the Christian world. So make the time special, even in this quarantine time. And finally, for the first time since 1943, the 121st Navy-Army game, notice the order in which I said that, is being played at Mikey Stadium at West Point. Navy leads in the series 61-52 in 7 ties. We're hoping at the end of the day it'll be 62-52 in 7 ties. But we hope that if you were there for the countdown clock, you enjoyed the images of the games past being projected, and the special sounds of the Rock Creek String Trio. I just love that group. For our entire brilliant and hardworking staff, we wish you an amazing day and holiday season. Go Navy, beat Army out here. Thank you very much.